Did you hear about the school in London that was teaching children they're privileged because they're white? How about the school that was recently downgraded by regulators because it was spending so much time teaching children dubious theories of race, even separating them on the basis of their race in after-school clubs? Or how about the council in Brighton, which was found to be encouraging schools to teach children about their inherited racial guilt? Or the school in Surrey, which was found to be teaching children the white supremacy pyramid, which essentially tells them that feeling indifferent about race puts you on the pathway towards the Ku Klux Klan and committing racial genocide. Or recently, a school in London was found to be offering extra lessons to black children that were not available to their white counterparts. What is going on? The answer is 3 words: critical race theory, or CRT. Critical race theory is a radical political belief system which is being imported into Britain from abroad and is now seeping into our institutions, into our schools, universities, civil service, and more. It's founded on the belief that all Western nations like Britain are organized around racism and a system of white supremacy. Adults and children who belong to the white majority must accept they are inherently racist. They must seek forgiveness for their white privilege and their collective guilt, and they must accept that by failing to attack or undermine their whiteness, they are perpetuating this system of white supremacy. Britain, seen through the eyes of CRT, is an institutionally racist country, where everything from the economy to the royal family are mere camouflage for this underlying discrimination. Any differences in outcomes among different groups are not because of very different rates of family breakdown, very different levels of educational achievement, or very different cultural values. They are simply because of racism. And for these reasons, critical race theory claims that minorities that are allegedly being held back by discrimination must be given preferential treatment over the white majority, which is why CRT pushes for things like affirmative action and positive discrimination against what it argues are privileged groups, like the white majority, or in other countries, Asian minorities. Critical race theory is divisive, it's dangerous, and it's profoundly un-British. But it's now going mainstream in our schools, indoctrinating an entire generation of children in dangerous and divisive ideas and pushing them apart on the basis of their race. Many people out there will tell you that this is not happening. They'll tell you that people like me are trying to stoke a culture war, but they're gaslighting you. This is happening. You can see it in how our schools, our institutions, and corporations are now embracing the buzzwords of CRT. Microaggressions, whiteness, white privilege, white guilt, institutional racism, allyship, anti-racism training, unconscious bias. And as I've been pointing out for a while, you can also see it reflected in the findings of several detailed, independent, and meticulous studies, which all show that critical race theory is now becoming embedded in our primary and secondary schools. One study, which submitted freedom of information requests to a random sample of local councils across England, found that at least 1 in 4 of them were encouraging schools in their areas to promote critical race theory. And 70% of the ones that were doing this were run by the Labour Party. Another, based on extensive survey data, found that more than 60% of British 18-year-olds have been exposed to or been taught CRT ideas at school, like white privilege, unconscious bias, and systemic racism. And these ideas are often presented as though they're fact, when in fact they are actually a highly political belief system. And another study, based on a detailed examination of nearly 50 companies which are brought into schools to teach children about race, found that 48 of them were indoctrinating kids in critical race theory. Many of the people who are spreading these ideas think they are making Britain and the world a better place. Many of them think they are continuing the work of earlier civil rights campaigners like Martin Luther King. But they are wrong. those earlier campaigners would be horrified by critical race theory. Why? Because it's a revolutionary and illiberal political ideology which is hardwired to push us apart. It's not interested in bringing children and adults together. It's merely replacing the old Marxist economic divide between the oppressed workers and oppressor capitalists with a new identity divide between people who belong to the white majority, the new oppressors, and people who belong to victimized minorities. And like Marxism, the implication of critical race theory is crystal clear. Our society must be completely transformed through an ongoing revolution, through ongoing work, in which our identity, our history, our culture, and our institutions must be erased, upended, or denigrated. That's why you hear things like the British countryside is racist. It's why you hear things like British institutions, such as the royal family, are racist. It's also why critical race theory is profoundly illiberal. It continuously prioritizes fixed group identities over individual rights. Critical race theory is not interested in your son or daughter because of who they are, because of their individual character. It's interested in them merely because they are a member of a particular race. Are they a member of the morally inferior white majority, or are they a member of the morally superior victimized minorities? In this way, CRT is reshaping our society around a new divisive moral hierarchy where minorities and their white allies are on top while everybody else is at the bottom. And critical race theory is also illiberal because it opposes free speech and free expression, arguing that these things are used to maintain a system of white supremacy. It routinely suggests that government should restrict free speech, which is racist or hateful, and continually expands those concepts to try and discredit anybody who opposes or merely challenges its claims. Critical race theory is openly hostile towards any evidence or research which does undermine its arguments. Like the large pile of research which shows that minority groups in Britain are now routinely outperforming their white counterparts at every level of the education system, or a large pile of research which shows clearly that levels of racism in British society have never been as low as they are today. CRT is not interested in any of that because fundamentally it is not supportive of empirical research and the scientific method. It is instinctively opposed to the values of the Enlightenment, which is why it argues that things like mathematics and science are also racist. It opposes a system of meritocracy which has organized our society for decades. And by trying to get rid of things which it argues are racist, it is continuously lowering the standards in our schools, universities, and other institutions. We saw this, for example, in Britain when Tony Sewell was attacked by much of the media and the activist class merely for suggesting that Britain is not an institutionally racist society, and merely for suggesting that the differences in outcomes among different groups are because of a complex array of factors, from family breakdown to poverty to educational achievement. And because Tony Sewell did not accept the core claim of critical race theory, which is that Britain is institutionally racist and all disparities are because of discrimination, he even had the offer of an honorary degree at the University of Nottingham rejected. That university saw no problem at all in continuing to invest in communist China and taking money from communist China. Critical race theory is not interested in any of that, in the evidence and the research, because it simply and lazily views countries like America and Britain as being one of the same, as discredited racist countries which have identical historical and cultural experiences, when in fact, as we all know, they are entirely different, with completely different experiences with race relations and discrimination. CRT is also problematic because it's reshaping Western societies around a culture of victimhood. It's encouraging our children to see themselves as victims who are being oppressed, which undermines their sense of agency, their belief that they can shape their own destiny, or it leaves them with the sense that they belong to a stigmatized majority group and should live their lives feeling shame and guilt. And this is having consequences. Recent studies have found that when you teach people dubious ideas like white privilege, they become less sympathetic of working class whites, the very people who are being left behind most visibly in our education and economic system. And CRT is also problematic because it routinely violates the need for our public institutions to remain impartial and politically neutral. It uses the instruments of the state, like our schools, universities, and civil service, to enforce this simplistic, divisive, binary worldview on everybody else, while also trying to silence dissenters. So what should we do about it? Well, one thing we need to do right now is get critical race theory out of Britain's schools. As the research shows, many of these ideas are being spread by external companies that are brought in to teach kids about race. And those companies are often led by radical ideologues who teach critical race theory as though it's fact, who are not regulated, who are not monitored, and who are not required to make their materials available to mums and dads who want to know what their kids are being taught. I think the government should launch a full review to explore the role and presence and impact of critical race theory in our schools and other public institutions. I think it should regulate companies that are brought in to teach people about race. I think it should remind all of our schools that they have a legal duty to be politically impartial, that any ideas should be presented in a balanced way, and they should make it clear that parents should always be allowed to access the materials that are being used to teach their children about highly contentious ideas. That's a start. But over the longer term, I think we also need to raise awareness of this issue in British society. We need to help mums and dads and others make sense of critical race theory and empower them to call it out when they see it. We all oppose racism. We all oppose discrimination. We all want Britain to remain the welcoming and tolerant country that it is today. But I think we all now need to work together to oppose a radical political ideology which is hurting and dividing our children. And you can begin to do that by sharing this video. Thank you.